Welcome back to the Steelers Now pregame scout for week 2. I know many of you happy to move on from week 1, and I guess so are we. We have an extra day and a half to talk about it because the Steelers don't play again until they host the Browns on Monday night. The opener against the Niners, it was anticipated to play at home in week 1. The Steelers hadn't done that in several seasons. Well, I guess be careful what you wish for. But Derrick Bell joins me, analyst at SteelersNow.com. I suppose if you're going to have a performance like that, Derrick, make it week 1 when you still have 16, 17, hopefully more weeks to improve off of it.
Yeah, man, it was a absolutely brutal, season opener for the Steelers. At home, like you mentioned. I think it was, it was definitely not the performance that either of us expected. Not that the Steelers had an easy opponent or anything like that, but just coming into the week, there was some optimism, and things just never really quite materialized. And week 1 can kind of be a little bit weird. You just look at recent seasons, but even this year, with the Chiefs, the Bills, the Bengals all losing, all teams that we kind of anticipate contending, within this AFC conference. So it's good to just kind of put this one behind us a little bit and hopefully move forward. And hopefully we'll see a lot better and cleaner of a product on Monday night against the Browns.
And as you know, these are not your daddies or granddaddies or even your older brother's Browns. It's going to be a much more competitive rivalry. We couldn't even really call it a rivalry for a while, but now it certainly is, more so than just in name. But before we can look forward to the next game coming up against the Browns on Monday night, we really do have to look back. I'm sorry, but we have to do it to make sense of what this team is capable of, although it's fair to say that's probably the worst that this Steelers group could play. And let's start with the most important position on the field, that, of course, being quarterback. And Kenny Pickett might have set the record for quickest come down from preseason hype. I know it is the preseason, but we had reason for optimism, and so did the Steelers, of how their young QB was going to play in that opening test against the Niners. But honestly, he fell short in essentially every area.
You watch the game live, it was probably worse on tape. There was nothing about the numbers that looked good. You score 7 points, albeit, you have to acknowledge the things that the Niners did on defense to kind of really slow them down. A lot of their players, had excellent performances. Fred Warner was excellent. I thought that some of their pass rushers were excellent as well. Drake Jackson had a really good game, but Pickett just never really looked comfortable, man. That was the big takeaway for me. Sometimes pass rush and having guys at your lap all the time will make quarterbacks, especially young guys, like a little jumpy in the pocket. But I really thought that Kenny was kind of erratic and jumpy from the gun. I mean, it really wasn't anything that the Niners did early. It was just, really from the first snap, just never really quite looked comfortable. And the offense as a whole kind of seemed out of sync because of that.
Now, as far as the X's and O's go, what did you think that Pickett struggled with the most? And is there some low-hanging fruit there that he can definitely get better at for week 2 against Cleveland?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, from takeaways or from games like that. I mean, there's tons of takeaways that you can go every bit of direction. There's a couple things that Kenny struggled with that I think that don't really concern me as much. I mean, I think the interceptions and some of the decision making throughout the course of the day drew a lot of criticism on social media. But given how I think Pickett was mostly fine, even as a rookie, as a decision maker, I'm not really ready to just freak out over some of those. And then accuracy too. He was really off accuracy wise on Sunday, but as a rookie, that really wasn't something we were overly concerned about. More of the concerns for me is just the pocket presence, the performing under pressure, with guys kind of in and around the pocket. Just the footwork aspect of it really was ugly, really throughout the day. And then just I think one of the biggest concerns too, they still just cannot access the middle of the field, man. They're not doing a good job, scheming things open over the middle of the field on a consistent basis. But even when it was there, he just didn't hit it. I mean, that they had a big play to Diontae Johnson over the middle of the field. That Pickett, kind of led him just a little bit too far. There were some other opportunities that he didn't quite pull the trigger on, or maybe accuracy was a problem there too. And I think those things are becoming more of a concern because they're showing up week after week after week.
Kenny said it after the game. the defense he faced in week one, a lot better than the defenses he faced in the
Oh yeah.
preseason, and better than most of the defenses he faced last year in the second half when he was much better. So, how much do we attribute the performance to just the fact the San Francisco defense, as we talked about last week, was going to be a tough challenge, maybe the toughest challenge of the year in week one?
Yeah, we talked about it. I mean, the Niners defense, I mean, it's loaded at every level. They have playmakers. There was very few weak spots, and I thought because of the way that the game unfolded, the Steelers didn't really even get to attack those weak spots as much because they fell behind the chains, they fell behind the scoreboard, which makes you one dimensional. And overall, like I said, you got to credit them for playing extremely well. I thought that the biggest thing over the course of the game that I just kept noticing live and then on tape was Fred Warner was absolutely incredible. Dre Greenlaw as well. They just did such a good job of communicating in the middle of the field, really closing some passing lanes, and then just in the run game too. Granted, the Steelers didn't have the opportunity to run the ball too much. I just thought that they were really flowing extremely well to the ball. One of the things that's always stood out to me from the Niners defensive perspective, no matter who the coordinator is, even under Kyle Shanahan, who's an offensive head coach, they fly to the football. I mean, when somebody gets tackled, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hats to the ball, and that's just their identity. And like you said, man, I mean, you always got to give the other team credit because they do. Those guys get paid too.
How much of a comparison is there, or how close of a comparison is there, to put it a different way, between the San Francisco defense and the Cleveland defense? I'm not sure we would have put them in the same category, but based on their week one performance, well, the Browns made the Bengals look rather inept and shut down one of the best quarterbacks in the league in Joe Burrow. And honestly, it wasn't even close in week one there. So do you feel like that we should upgrade what we thought about the Browns deep?
I think you have to, right? I mean, Cleveland was a weird team to talk about, when you were trying to kind of assess the expectations for that group, going into the season, not just because of the quarterback position, but man, Cleveland's had talents on defense in the past recent seasons. They've just woefully underperformed year after year after year. They had to go out and get a new defensive coordinator. Jim Schwartz, I put out a article, kind of a little film room study about some of the things that Schwartz did. Kind of some wrinkles that they threw at Joe Burrow. There was some ugly Joe Burrow numbers. Yesterday or on Sunday. I mean, I think he was 2 for 13. Or he was 2 completions on 13 dropbacks against the blitz. They were moving Myles Garrett all around the front. Of course, Mike Tomlin acknowledged that pretty much everything on the defensive front really starts with 95. Right, we're familiar with him, but. I thought that they were absolutely outstanding. Their secondary played extremely well. Mike Tomlin talked about in his press conference, that he thought that was the biggest point of the game. The fact that Cleveland was willing to put their guys on an island against those talented Cincinnati receivers in man-to-man coverage, and it took some guts to pull a performance like that off. The rain and the weather certainly aided the defenses in that game. But, when you come out and you shut down, what we probably assume in the Bengals is a top 5 team in the NFL again this year. When you shut them down to 7 points, that's incredibly impressive, man.
Joe Burrow, 14 for 31 against the Browns for 82 yards, 14
A
completions for
career low.
82 yards. That's something. That'll get your attention as we head on into week two against a Browns team that historically over the years has not given the Steelers much trouble, but it appears to be a new era really on both sides of the matchup. That brings us to second down. Yes, the offensive concerns abound, not just about Kenny Pickett, although he is the cornerstone, the most key player, as every quarterback is on every NFL team. But you brought up his name earlier a little bit, Derek. Diontae Johnson out with a hamstring injury, looking like at least a moderately severe injury. So it might be a few weeks with the Steelers having to adapt to not having, let's just call him the receiver most likely to be open on any given play. I know there's been a lot of talk and complaints about his hands and about the drops over the years, but there's no doubting. You look at the tape, and the guy is open consistently, and opposing defenses have to account for him, whether he actually makes every play on every ball thrown his way or not. So what do you think is the compensation plan for the lack of Diontae, at least here for this week against the Browns?
Yeah, I mean, There's often a little bit of security in a guy that can win really quickly and create a lot of separation. People, consistently ask why Diontae gets so many targets. Well, guys that are frequently open get a lot of targets. That's just how the NFL works, man. I mean, if you're creating that separation, the quarterbacks are going to tend to look your way. And, he's the first read, on the backside of formations, that they go to him in, isolation situations as well. And I think that was just watching kind of how the game unfolded between the Bengals and the Browns last week. That skill set would have been incredibly nice to have this week. The Browns' talented trio of corners. They got Martin Emerson and Denzel Ward on the outside, and then Greg Newsome on the inside. Like I said, if the Browns were comfortable living in that world of, okay, we're going to play a lot of middle field closed, a lot of press man coverage against the Bengals receivers, they're going to do it against anybody. I mean, if you have the confidence to do it against Higgins and Chase, you're going to do it against anybody. So having, your best man-to-man beater would have been extremely helpful. Now, this is going to open the door for guys like Calvin Austin, George Pickens, potentially to see an expanded role. They're going to need Allen Robinson as well. I mean, this is going to be a huge test for this receiving core, really, without their leader heading into Monday Night Football.
Now, as far as the running game is concerned for the Steelers, Najee Harris just 31 yards last week, had the 24-yard run in the 2-minute offense at the end of the first half, which was the first down for the Steelers in the game. Tells you how that whole thing went. Warren just 3 carries for 6 yards, and Pickett had a scramble. So, in essence, 9 called runs for the Steelers last week. They got behind big early, got behind multiple touchdowns early. So that's just what's going to happen in the NFL, especially when you don't have a dominant run game, and the Steelers certainly don't. But they'd love to develop that, I would imagine, at least get it up to league average here this season. So what's holding back the run game besides just scoring situation from last week?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's scoring situation. Mike Tomlin talked about how the Steelers didn't win the weighty downs, and I thought that was a really pertinent phrase, to use. And when you start 0 for 5 on your first 5 possessions on third down, you're not going to possess the ball enough. If the defense wasn't getting stops, they were on the field a bunch early in the game. The offense turned the ball over, which didn't help. And then when you're consistently finding yourself in those spots, you just ruin the opportunity to get more attempts. That's just how that works, man. And I don't think that there was anything. It's not like the Steelers abandoned the run unnecessarily, but like once you fall down 17-0, I mean, you're going to lose that quote unquote balance aspect of your offense. And I thought that the run game blocking wasn't particularly great either. You even looked at some of the plays that they had that didn't really go anywhere. One that sticks out in my brain was, they ran what I would classify as mid zone from an under center look, and they handed the ball off to Harris, and Dan Moore and Sam Aller were on a combo block, and Moore sticks with his block too long before moving to the second level, and Fred Warner just comes in and absolutely cleans Harris's clock in the backfield. And the run blocking wasn't great. You mentioned that 20-something yard run that he had in the 2-minute drill. That was really the result of Harris making a lot of that money kind of himself. So it was a frustrating performance, but against this Browns team, man, they invested a lot. They brought in Dalvin Tomlinson to help shore up some of the run game issues from a season ago. But they've invested a lot in their pass rushers. They bring in Zadarius Smith. We know what Myles Garrett is on that side of the ball. One of the best ways to counteract a good pass rush, and they were all over Joe Burrow last week as well. But one of the best ways to counteract that is run the ball at them. Make them have to earn the right to rush the passer.
Allen Robinson had a nice debut for the Steelers last week. 5 receptions on 8 targets for 64 yards. The longest catch, 31 yards. We also saw Pickens and Austin throwing a handful of catches apiece. Pat Freiermuth had the lone touchdown. So out of those playmakers, who do you think can make the biggest difference this week with Diontae Johnson out?
Yeah, I mentioned that the really trio of receivers are going to have a really tough time. I mean, Cleveland's invested a lot of resources into upgrading that secondary. Ward, top 10 pick. You think about Greg Newsome was a first round pick. Even Martin Emerson was a day 2 pick. So they put their resources back there, and they're getting their money's worth right now, right? So I think that, they had some good safety play last week. The whole defense played well, but, Pat Freiermuth, man, we got to get more than one catch.
Mhm.
I thought that Pickett missed him on a couple of occasions when you looked at the film. He had that weird third down where, the ball kind of slid off his hands a little bit. I'm not sure if he turned the wrong way or if maybe he was expecting it on a different shoulder or if Pickett just missed him, if he just dropped it. Kind of a weird kind of play. But, Freiermuth, we talk about losing Diontae Johnson. Freiermuth's the guy that should see probably maybe if not the most expanded role this week because they're going to really need him to win some of those one-on-one man coverage reps against, JOK, some of the Browns safeties, who knows about Juan Thornhill, but, Grant Delpit played really well last week. He's going to need to win that matchup. So, for tight ends in general, they're a good way to access the middle of the field. So I think if I'm looking for somebody to take on, like to have a big game and to win their matchup, I think it probably needs to be Pat.
All right, let's move on to third down. We're going to keep it on the offensive side, though, because I think that was the topic du jour this week, and for good reason, because of how much the performance dropped off from the preseason. And of course, when you talk offense, you're going to talk offensive coordinator. I think 32 offensive coordinators across the NFL take their shares of slings and arrows over the course of now a 17-game regular season plus the playoffs, if you're fortunate. But Matt Canada now in his third year, and it hasn't progressed the way that I think a lot of us thought and maybe even hoped that it would, whether it was Ben Roethlisberger under center or now Kenny Pickett for the last season plus a handful of games. So, in fact, it was the guy who used to throw passes around here and did it for a long time, Ben Roethlisberger himself, who got on Matt Canada during his football and broadcast podcast, videocast, whatever you want to call it, from his house, saying that under Randy Fichtner, the previous offensive coordinator, Roethlisberger would have gotten some quote-unquote easy plays, or at least some plays that he liked to get the ball out of his hands quickly and get it in the hands of some of those playmakers and maybe let them make a move, maybe let them carry some of that heavy lifting early as he got into the flow of things. Do you feel like that's fair criticism for Canada? There were, some of those short dump-off passes, some of those, shall we call them extended runs, not necessarily true passing game, but ways to get the ball in the hands of, say, Harris and company around the line of scrimmage. But according to Ben Roethlisberger, he didn't think it was enough of that. He didn't think that Canada helped out his quarterback enough. So, number one, do you agree? And number two, does Pickett need a little bit more of that because of the stage that he's at in his career?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some validity to that statement. When a quarterback struggles that bad, you talked about earlier starting off, first 9 dropbacks, he had like negative yardage, I think, if you include the sack totals.
Mm-hmm.
So when a quarterback starts off like that, you have to at least address a little bit of, the game plan, the game script, the opening script, if you will. But, there were plays out there that Kenny just didn't make either. So it was really, there was enough blame to go around for both of them, and honestly, that's often the case when you have a performance that just is that ugly, more or less. But what Ben is kind of talking to is, throughout the week, through the game plan period, the offensive coordinator, the quarterback will get together and say, all right, well, if we start getting a bunch of too high looks, what plays do you like against too high? If we start getting a bunch of man to man, what plays do you like against this? What was frustrating to me when I was going back and watching the film, the Niners didn't disguise a single thing that they did on defense. They were so static pre-snap. They showed you exactly what coverages they were in. If they were playing man-to-man, they didn't disguise it. They didn't move the safeties around. It was really clear for the quarterback to see what was going on. They ran quarters coverage, I think, on 18 of Pickett's like 52-ish dropbacks at a really high rate. If it wasn't quarters, it was more than likely cover 3. They didn't do a lot of crazy stuff in the back end to really confuse them. So it was kind of confusing to me that they couldn't get into some better plays to get the ball out, to get him more comfortable. Quarterbacks, like you'll hear even broadcasters, like especially the former quarterback broadcasters, talk about, the get a completion plays, get the ball out, one step, quick game, get the ball out, give a couple completions. And you saw Pickett get in a little bit of rhythm before the half with them going up tempo, getting the ball out of his hands. And, you felt optimistic, like, all right, he's settled in. Even if the Steelers weren't going to win the game after coming out of the halftime, you felt a little bit more optimistic about his ability to at least get in a little bit more of a groove. And man, it just wasn't sustainable. He came out in the second half and it was really just more of the same with him looking really uncomfortable. So, Canada owns at least a portion of that blame as well.
We discussed it last week. Under Canada, the Steelers have scored 30 points, I think 3 total times. It's the numbers aren't pretty in that regard. I know he's been working with a rookie or a young quarterback for the majority of that time now, but still, this dates back to Roethlisberger's last season too. In fact, the Steelers have scored 20 points or more under Canada in less than half their games, and that's just under Canada, and that's just not going to get it done, to put it frankly, in today's NFL. I know that defenses had the run of things in week one, but I would wager over the course of the 4 months upcoming that we're going to see offensive numbers commensurate with where offense has been, which is to say you pretty much have to score 30 to give yourself a reasonable chance to win. I don't care how good your defense is. It's just the way the league is. It's the way the sport is going. And it's the way the sport is officiated as well, at least at the top level pros. So what's your biggest criticism? If you had to look at Matt Canada, take a step or a few steps back and just look at his body of work with the Steelers, what is your biggest negative for how he's gone about his business?
I would say, a couple things. I mean, again, when you don't have a ton of success, it's easy to kind of point out just a myriad of different reasons that for the struggles. And just a couple things, like their run game doesn't necessarily set up their pass game. Like they're really zone heavy. They run a ton of outside zone, but they don't really have anything in their passing game that kind of works off of that. The only real thing that kind of looks the same or is like a nice change up is they do a lot of bootlegs, like whether it's they run a lot of slide concepts, which is just play action. You kind of run a guy on almost like a drag route to the other side of the field, on some of those like naked bootlegs. But there's no play action passing game whatsoever to speak of for the Steelers. I mean, they are operating basically in a different sport than everyone else, especially for young quarterbacks around their league that are having some success. They get nothing from their play action game. I mean, I think Pickett threw off play action 3 times on Sunday, and I think he had 4 total yards on those 3 passes. I mean, it's hard to play football when you don't get anything out of that area of the game. And then I just think from a passing game standpoint, just to kind of continue that, if they run motion, last season, this is a big thing I had. If they ran motion pre-snap, it's a run play. If they don't do motion, then it's probably a pass play. It's so predictable, and even the route concepts themselves are just really unimaginative. It's a lot of depending on guys to win one-on-one instead of using formations and change-ups to get guys good looks, to scheme them open in the middle of the field. So there's plenty of things to critique, and and guys not executing either. And when guys don't execute when the plays are there, that's how you get a product that looks like the Steelers offense that we saw on Sunday.
What do you attribute his success at Pitt? I think he had pretty good reviews with the Panthers. Then, of course, in the SEC, didn't seem like it worked out. Whether that was a personality thing or a scheme thing, I'm not exactly sure. But then he gets an opportunity here with the Steelers. Is it a college pro thing? Is it a lesser talent in the ACC compared to the SEC and especially the NFL? What do you think has gone on there? Because the guy did rise to this position for certain reasons because he had some success at lower levels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the resume as a whole doesn't look particularly impressive when you think about guys that have been around the game, even at the higher college level and now the NFL level. But I think that there's the big difference between the NFL and college. I just think that there's so much more game planning that goes on throughout the calendar year, man. Like, for example, you put something on tape and it's like you have to consistently. I think if you look around the best offensive coordinators around the league, they're consistently building on their product. That they find success with something, but they understand that okay, we can run this same play, 3-4 weeks in a row when we really need it on third down or in the red zone. But that gets put on tape, and then a month later you play a division rival and they're 100% ready. If it's 3rd and 5 and they come out in 11 personnel, this is what they like to do. You have to continually evolve your offense, and put new wrinkles in to take advantage of the opponents keying in on certain things, certain tendencies that you have. And I just really feel like over the course of Canada's tenure, we haven't really seen a lot of evolution. This offense looks extremely similar to the one that we saw Ben operating in, his last season of his career. And, that's particularly frustrating because they haven't really had a ton of success. You mentioned all the different numbers. They've still yet to put together a 400-yard game, something that every NFL team has done multiple times in the past several years. So, I don't know if I can pinpoint one exact thing, but I just think the lack of evolution and the creativity that's really necessary in today's NFL, because we talk about how explosive these offenses are and how the game is so shifted towards that side of the football. These defensive coordinators are still pretty good. I mean, they're pretty smart, and you got to think about how difficult that job is with the rules, like you said, being so heavily slanted to the other side of the football. So you just have to consistently evolve, and the Steelers' offense is just not that
Yeah.
way.
Well, it's a good discussion. I'm sure we could keep talking for another half an hour, but I want to get to the defensive side of it, and I want to get to our fourth down here on the pregame scout because the defense should not be let off the hook for week one. I know much of the talk's been about the guys who hold onto the football, but Brock Purdy looked really good against the Steelers. Of course, a Shanahan run offense, you expect to see some success. You expect to be challenged scheme wise, and the Steelers were. But you saw the Niners playmakers make those plays. Christian McCaffrey, 152 yards. If there's one aspect of last week's game that might concern me the most, at least for the defensive side of the ball for the Steelers, it's that because you're going to be going up against Nick Chubb this week. And the Browns run heavy offense. They love to work off of that. I know Deshaun Watson can do some things out there, but I just feel like the run game is the number one priority to stop if you're Pittsburgh. So how do you feel about it, especially considering that Cam Heyward is out for a couple of months here and just had surgery on his groin? So he played a few plays. Heyward's into his mid-30s, but he's still a stalwart on the Steelers' defensive front. So where do the Steelers go from here as they try to shut down the Browns?
Yeah, it's a tough loss, right, man? Like he's going to end up missing probably a good chunk of the season, which is really disappointing on a ton of different levels. But replacing Cam, like Mike Tomlin said in his presser this week, it's not going to be a one-person job. Like you're going to have to supplement multiple different guys out there and kind of, hopefully get really good contributions from some young guys like DeMarvin Leal. Probably see some expanded roles for guys like Isaiah Loudermilk. Keanu Benton's going to need to have a really nice day. I thought that he was one of the bright spots probably against the Niners in that performance on Sunday. But, I think that the big thing you mentioned stopping Nick Chubb, that was the number one thing that Tomlin talked about this week, kind of the similar conversation that we had on this show and Tomlin had in his press conference the week before about Christian McCaffrey. You have to stop the run. The Steelers didn't do a good job of that last week, but Nick Chubb is a guy that they've had some success against. He's had some big games. He's had some not so big games, but definitely one of the most talented, if not the most talented, pure running back in the league. He can do everything, man. He can run zone. He can run gap. He's excellent, contact balance wise. He can break tackles, break big runs. So he could do a little bit of everything, and he's absolutely the number one focus point, kind of on this Browns offense.
And passing wise, what I don't want to say scares you, but what threatens you the most out of what the Browns can do through the air?
You know, This, like I said, the Browns were a weird team to try to discuss in the offseason just because, like, there were so many question marks about how this was going to look, despite how much talent was on the roster, just on paper. They're trying to mend what Watson likes to do, and what Stefanski likes to do, and what Chubb likes to do.
Hmm.
And that sometimes can look a little bit weird. And it even did last week at times. Watson took about half of his dropbacks out of play action. 8.4 yards per attempt off play action, 2.5 yards per attempt just on straight dropbacks. There was a significant difference there. Watson really likes to be in the gun. Nick Chubb is always operated well out of the gun, but the majority of his snaps have always come from under center. It just makes the reads a little bit different. Some backs just prefer it that way. But Stefanski, his offense is mostly under center heavy. So they're kind of morphing into more shotgun, into more gun run stuff. But with Watson, I think the biggest thing with him, man, is like he doesn't really want to play on time or in structure. He wants to kind of just take his time back there, kind of dance around the pocket and just go into kind of creation mode. And that's what you really got to worry about him. You got to make sure that you're, staying within your gaps, making sure you're staying sound in your rush lane integrity. Because he'll hold the ball for 4, 5, 6 seconds. You'll have the opportunity to get some sacks, some big plays off of him, but also those can create some splash down the field. If you don't stay connected to receivers and keep the ball in front of you.
Last week for Watson, 16 for 29, 154 yards. So pretty pedestrian stuff, at least by modern NFL standards. Threw for a touchdown, also threw a pick. Nick Chubb had 106 yards on the ground. Also, Jerome Ford got 15 carries for the Browns, but just 36 yards. Deshaun Watson scrambled 5 times for 45 yards. So like you mentioned there, he's looking to make plays with his feet as well as his arm. And one of the Browns' 2 scores came via his legs as well. So some things to look out for. Of course, you have all of Derrick's coverage on SteelersNow.com, both pregame and postgame coming up after the Steelers host the Browns at Acrisure Stadium. That's about an 8:20 p.m. kickoff on ESPN. So for Derrick Bell, I'm Matt Gajtka reminding you to go to PGH Steelers Now on social media and SteelersNow.com for all the coverage of our local football club's 91st National Football League season. We'll talk to you next week.